A very warm welcome to everyone. It's fantastic to see so many people already saying hello and introducing themselves in the chat. We're delighted to be launching our new report, Peace at the Heart, a relational approach to education in British schools. Welcome if you're joining us from England, Scotland, Wales, or from further afield. Welcome if you're weary, especially if it's after a long day's teaching and learning. Welcome if you know exactly why you're here for the launch of this report, and welcome if you're not sure yet. We're grateful to our friends in our shared world who've helped promote this event as part of the Movement for Sustainable Development Goal 4.7, which includes education for peace and non-violence. I'm so happy to see so many of you joining us today. We know that participants are teachers, politicians, policymakers, parents, volunteers, and as you can see in the chat, come from a whole range of organisations. Thank you all for being here. I'm personally really grateful to have the report because I know from experience the difference peace education can make. I've been in playgrounds where parents have come and told me that a peer mediation scheme has been the best thing a school has ever done, and you'll hear more about that later. I've had young people come up to me and say a Peace and Human Rights Week they've been part of has been the most enjoyable and meaningful thing they've done at school. And I've sat with young people in a circle where they've explored the ethics of armed drones with such care and thoughtfulness that I know the value, but to have so many different elements of peace education put together in this report is just fantastic. So across the next hour and a half, we'll hear from the report's main author, David G, and several voices from the world of peace education. We'll see film clips showing peace education in practice, followed by some panel discussion. In the autumn, we'll host interactive workshops where we can exchange thoughts on putting these ideas into practice, and we hope many of you will be able to join us for them. This report was inspired by the work of the Quaker Council for European Affairs in Brussels. They wrote a report to influence EU policymakers to support peace education, and it encouraged us to make the same case in the British context. It, of course, builds on a long history of peace education work by Quakers and many others. The report quotes bell hooks, who describes the classroom, for all its limitations, as a location of possibility. This report shines a light on some of the amazing work for peace already happening across Britain. And it also shows the hope and possibility that we can build on in our schools. We've got a brilliant panel with us today, and I'm really grateful to all of them for taking part. To introduce the panel, we're going to do this via a check-in, which will be very familiar to some of you and seem quite strange, possibly to others. A check-in is something done in a lot of workplaces and schools who are trying to build a peaceful culture. It's just some kind of question which helps you share a little bit with the idea that we have to share something of ourselves and connect with each other if we want to build peace, because peace isn't something that just happens, it's an active thing. It could be many different questions. A popular question at the Carr Manor Community School is, if you could be anywhere in the world right now, where would you want to be? And if anyone else wants to answer this question in the chat, if you haven't introduced yourself already, and I can see many of you have, which is fantastic, feel free to say who you are and where in the world you'd like to be. So I'll start off and then bring in our panelists. Okay, I'm Isabel Cartwright from Quakers in Britain, and I'd like to be on a beach in West Wales. The sun is shining in Wales at the moment. Tom Shaw, Director of Research and Development at Carr Manor Community School. Where in the world would you like to be?
Hello, good afternoon to everybody. This is a question that we often use at Carr Manor. Obviously, the pupils immediately respond, well, where they are in school. Occasionally, there are other answers. For me right now, probably I would love to be up in the Orkney Islands. There's a beautiful beach that we go to. I don't like to tell people about it because we're often the only ones there.
Thank you, Tom. We're both on beaches in different parts of the world. We haven't gone that far either, have we? Okay, thank you. And Jane Harries from the Welsh Centre for International Affairs, where would you be?
Now I've thought about this one. I think I'd like to be in Costa Rica. And the reason I choose Costa Rica I don't know how I'm going to get there. I'd have to get there sustainably, but partly because of the amazing ecosystems they have there, but also because they abolished the military, and I'd love to see what that looks like.
They have a
as
peace
a society.
constitution, don't they, Jane? Yeah,
Yeah.
fantastic. Maybe I should join you there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. Jackie, oh no, Hamidah we're going to go to next. Hamidah Siddiqua, Head of History at EGA School, Islington.
Hello, everyone. I had a thought about this. At the moment, it's been a very exhausting school year, so I would like to be somewhere in a beach, somewhere in the Bahamas, possibly. That would be a great getaway.
Sounds lovely, Hamidah. Thank you. Thank you for joining us after a tiring day as well. We can see you're still in school there, as is Tom. Lovely. Jackie Zammit, Programme Director at Peacemakers. How about you?
Hi there, everybody. Well, yesterday I was contacted by a friend who I haven't seen for 20 years because she's been living overseas, and she's in Wales. So if I could be anywhere right now, I think I would be with her in Wales, having a cup of tea and a catch up.
Sounds lovely, Jackie. Maybe I could wave to you from my beach. Thank you. David G, our report's main author. Where would you be, David?
I was literally going to say I would like to be in Orkney because there's a beach I know there and I'd like to be there. I'm not sure it's the same beach, but I might see you there, Tom, one day. I don't know.
Tom's beach is secret, but there's other people in the chat saying that they know beaches in Orkney. Lovely. Thank you, David. And Paul Parker, recording clerk, Quakers in Britain. Where would we find you?
Hello, everyone. You'd find me under canvas in my tent in Shropshire, where I was last week.
Lovely. Thank you, everybody. You will get to know the panelists as our evening continues. And before we present the report, Paul Parker is going to say a few words about why Quakers have this concern for peace education and why he's excited about the report. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Izzy, and hello, everybody. We live in a world which faces many challenges at the moment. The horrifying reality of a war in Europe, the threat of a serious escalation of that conflict, the very real dangers posed by our changing climate, growing displacement and migration of people, shortages of resources, food scarcity, growing economic inequality globally, and increasingly polarized societies and political landscapes, including here in the UK. And it may not be true for the next generation to say, you never had it so good. So how do Quakers, with our belief that there is intrinsic value in all human life, respond to this? Well, we find that the world will need resilient people, reconcilers, peace builders, people who reach out beyond their circle and their own selfish interests. Early Quakers would have called them prophets, I think. In today's language, perhaps we'd call them change makers. So this report, Peace at the Heart, and much more importantly, all the work and ideas and experience which lie behind it, is part of our Quaker response to those burgeoning crises in our world. It's about how we live together. After all, we have to share this world and this society with each other and leave them in a fit state for future generations to enjoy. And doing so peacefully will be so much nicer and above all, so much safer for us all. What has all that got to do with education? On a simplistic level, you might think that education is where we sow the seeds of the communities of the future. The young people in our schools today will be, after all, community leaders, the politicians, the teachers, the social justice warriors, the business people, and the hard workers of the future. It's true. And if there are skilled and resilient peacemakers among them, they stand a better chance. But that isn't all. This is not just about the future. This is about today. Coming out of this pandemic with a war on our doorstep and dire warnings about missing our climate targets in the news only yesterday, we cannot wait for our young people to grow up to start constructing the society we want and need to see. And nor should we make it their responsibility to clear up after us. So this report, I think, above all, shows us how to begin doing the work that's needed now. It opens the way to transformation. It's an investment in our present, as well as in our shared futures. Thank you for coming to hear about it. I hope it inspires you as it inspires me.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I know that you, as a former long-standing teacher, feel particularly passionate about this work and about this report. So thank you very much. I'd now like to introduce the main author of the report. You've met him briefly already, and it's David G, who was an absolute privilege to work with on this. And David is going to talk us through the key ideas in the report. So over to you, David. If I can just say as well, if anyone does have thoughts or questions that they want to put in the chat, they can go ahead. We will try to gather these. My colleague Ellis will gather these and put some of those thoughts to the panel at the end. So over to you, David.
Hello, everyone, and thanks very much, Izzy. It's great to be able to introduce this report after all the work that's gone into it. I'm just going to spend a few moments introducing this new report, Peace at the Heart, outlining the approach and why we think something like this is needed in schools. First, to explain what we mean by relational approach, which is that the integrity of relationships, which is peace, is put at the heart of everything a school does. From the relationship that a student has with themselves, to the relationships they have with each other and with the staff, to the school as a community, as a convivial space where people feel like they belong and want to be, and the relationship between students and their wider world, and some of the social problems that Paul has just touched upon. So we mean peace in quite a particular way, not only as the absence of violence, although it is that, but also as the presence of good relationships that work well for everybody, just and equitable relationships, vitalizing relationships. Mindful as we want to be of the many ways in which relationships are harmful in the experiences of many young people, whether that's a neglect in the home or bullying in the playground, or the many societal forces that bear down on young people, perhaps more than ever before. And given this, we understand peace education to mean a really wide range of practices, which all in their various ways contribute to healthier relationships across school life, but also beyond school life as well. Some of those practices are fairly well established, like working in circles and mindfulness practices and critical approaches to subject areas in the curriculum, active citizenship, peer mediation schemes, and restorative practices. Others are more subtle, and they concern the way the school may, over time, build itself as a community of belonging, an inclusive community over time, move in that direction. So what we've tried to do is bring together these otherwise perhaps disparate practices of peace education under a single overarching commitment to peace as the integrity of relationships at every level, held within an ethic of care and a commitment to young people, a belief in them as individuals with hopes and wants, with the potential to flourish, every one of them. And together, taken together, the evidence favouring these practices is strong. It shows, for example, that they help to reduce bullying, they strengthen student engagement, and grades go up as well. But also, and more fundamentally, students are learning critical skills that will stand them in good stead for the rest of their lives. Empathy, collaboration, handling conflict well, critical thinking, social awareness, but also social concern. Where school then is not only a place where students imbibe facts, but also where they can feel they can flourish within a social context that values them all as individuals with gifts to bring. There are many benefits also to society at large. When young people are supported to relate empathically and critically, they become less vulnerable to politics that trade on hatred and exclusion. And when young people are supported to explore and express their social concern, they tend to be more willing to take active part in their own society and to take responsibility for it, making their own conscientious choices. And of course, as a result, there are many benefits for schools as well. When student engagement is stronger, when the student-teacher connection is stronger, when the community is more inclusive, and when there are fewer conflicts to deal with, that means calmer classrooms, it means less stressed teachers and higher job satisfaction as well. We're not suggesting for a moment it's anything like plain sailing, only that it's possible to move in this kind of general direction over time. It doesn't have to be perfect to be good and worth doing. The report makes a few recommendations, 5 of them, and I'll quickly whiz through them to end. The first is calling on education departments to confer a duty on schools to educate for healthy relationships. The second is to embed peace education principles and practices into initial teacher training and ongoing training. The third is to properly fund schools specifically to cultivate healthy relationships in their community. The fourth is to commission research to evaluate this kind of work and make recommendations for development. And the fifth deals very specifically with third parties coming into schools to engage with students to make sure that that contribution is genuinely educationally valuable and not exploitative in any way. That's 5 minutes, and that's the report in a nutshell. I'll hand back to Izzy.
Thank you so much, David, for such a clear overview of what's a very detailed report. And obviously, people who've registered have been sent the executive summary. The full report is now available and can be accessed via the Quakers in Britain website, so people can have time to really digest, because that was a lot to take in then. I know, David, when we were seeking feedback on the report, that one newly qualified teacher wrote back and said, "It fills me with hope," which I felt was a fantastic response. Let's have a look now at what it looks like in practice when a school makes this commitment to a whole school culture of peace.
What is conflict?
I think what causes conflict could be when two different people have a different opinion on a certain topic.
Can you give me an example of that?
Maybe what to have for dinner, or what game to play.
Thank you.
People have an argument and it can escalate, and then it can turn into a really big problem. What causes conflict is sometimes when you're walking home, there are some teenagers from a high school and they just start to bully you.
Curriculum pressures are really high. It is a really busy curriculum, but you have to decide what you want, and our school is led by a really strong set of values, and those values are all about developing our young people and investing in the people in our school environment, both the adults and the children, and peace is essential. So a happy, safe environment is the foundation and the bedrock of our curriculum. It means that every child can come to school every day and enjoy the learning that takes place, so we have to find space for it. Some of the ways in which we approach peace education is through circle time, through peer mediation, and through the wide variety of sports that we offer, so children can get along, play together and enjoy their curriculum.
Excellent. Can you get there, Jake? Can you get there? Good lad, well done.
Circle time, is it?
Yeah.
And then you're going to show the class what you have acted out, and then we can answer those questions. What does conflict look like? What does it sound like? And what does it feel like? Oh, very good. This group started. What word can we use instead of argument? Conflict. I've started doing these circle times with Peacemakers about 6-7 years ago now in a previous school. And initially I was really sceptical of it. And I thought, no, this is not going to work with, 7 and 8 year olds talking about peace. But actually just within the space of a few weeks, just doing regular circle times, regular peacemaker sessions really did make a difference to those children. They were able to discuss what their conflict was, what their arguments were, and they had some strategies in order to be able to solve those.
Brilliant. That's wonderful to see, isn't it? And that teacher was a bit sceptical at first, and by regularly doing the circle time has become a massive convert of peace education. Jackie, Programme Director at Peacemakers. John of Ralston is just one of the many schools that Peacemakers has worked with across the West Midlands, isn't it? We offer the full title of Peacemakers being the West Midlands Quaker Peace Education Project. We've seen a little of your work in the video, or certainly the effects of your work, but I know Peacemakers support schools in a whole range of ways. You run a range of peacemaker courses where children explore the different layers of peace and develop peace skills, teacher training, helping schools work effectively in circles and to develop restorative practice and school-wide approaches, as well as writing resources such as Learning for Peace, which has been very popular. So could you tell us a little bit about the difference you see in a school when they embrace peace in this way?
Yeah, thanks, Izzy, and it's good to see everybody. Good to be here. Well, the wonderful thing about peace, of course, is those multi-layers and that we've already heard about and is in the report. And that gives schools, and we can't always agree on what peace is. It means different things to different people. And that gives schools this amazing opportunity to really explore what it means for them, for their pupils, for their staff, for their parents. And then they can plan for it in a way that is meaningful and makes sense to them. But there's three things that I kind of have noticed when I see schools really embrace peace in this way, and they are curiosity, clarity, and care. So there's a really deep care for every single child, every single member of staff, and every single parent in those schools. And that's seen through the quality of the relationships, from the way people speak to each other and the way people behave with each other. And I think that's demonstrated by that level of curiosity, so that when something happens, something goes wrong, there's those lovely inquiry questions where people can say, I'm seeing this disengagement, or I'm seeing some aggression, and I'm just wondering what's going on underneath all of that. And that invites questions like, can you tell me what's happening? Are you happy to tell me what's happening with you right now? Okay, so it's that curiosity that we get. But then we also get that clarity of being clear about how we're going to build our relationships, how we're going to build peace in the school. And that's, peace is so much more than the absence of conflict, as David has already said. And then what emerges from all of that is a real confidence, a confidence to say, this is the way that we do things here. You're welcome to come to our school. You're welcome to visit and to be part of it. But this is how we do things. This is how we invest in relationships. This is how we repair our relationships, and that relationships are really critical to us. I think also alongside that, there's a sense of pride in being able to talk about peace, and you see people framing questions in slightly different ways. So they might start conversations with, how can I resolve conflict on our playgrounds? But then they have the confidence to reframe those questions to say, how can we build peace in our playgrounds? And those are different questions that invite different responses. So how are we going to manage conflicts, but also how are we going to build peace?
Thank you, Jackie. I love those three: curiosity, clarity, and care. And it was fantastic being in John of Ralston. And I definitely got that feeling from Richard, the head, that they weren't afraid of conflict, and they recognised that conflict's natural and it's not going to go away, but it's about having the skills to deal with it creatively and positively. And I think Peacemakers has given them the confidence as a school to do that. They actually call their circle times Peacemaker circle times, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
Okay, thank you. And in the report, peer mediation is discussed a lot, that interpersonal layer of peace, where I know you do a lot of training of young people and teachers in how to have a peer mediation scheme. I'd be interested if you could just say a tiny bit about kind of what it is and what you see happening when it works well, and perhaps whether there's certain things that need to be in place to make sure it works well.
Yeah, sure. So peer mediation is conflict resolution for young people by young people. So young people are trained to mediate conflicts on the playground. And it's wonderful because it gives children an opportunity to demonstrate just how able they are to problem solve when they're given the opportunity. It can work as a standalone piece of work, but if it's done within a culture of peace building within a wider culture, then it has a much greater chance, I think, of being more sustainable and just going that little bit deeper. So when it works at its best is when you've got that kind of congruence between the language and the way that young people are communicating, along with the way that adults are communicating. So they're kind of echoing each other around the school. If the mediators are doing one thing and then everybody else around them is doing something else, that can be a little bit confusing for the people involved. So what you want is that kind of that match, if you like, between what's going on around them. But what you see when it goes really well is confidence. Confidence from the mediators. They gain confidence in being able to problem solve. They learn how to de-escalate conflict in those mediations. Quite difficult stuff, but then they do it really, really well. And they're also much more socially and emotionally literate. And I just wanted to share one little story from one of the teachers that you saw on that video, Sam. When I was working with her in a previous school, we were in the corridor and two children came up to her and said, they were really upset. And they said, we've gone up the conflict escalator, we've had an argument, we've been using blaming language, and now we just don't know what to do. And she was able to say to them, well, do you remember what we did in our Peacemaker circles last week? And we talked a little bit about resolving conflict. Do you think you could do that, or do you need me to help you? And they said, no, we can do it, but we need you to be in the room with us. So she was able to leave them in a corner of the room while she was at her desk to resolve that problem. And it's those kinds of skills that we see happening when peer mediation and peace building is going on at the same time. I think, I suppose my parting message before I leave, I think my 5 minutes is up, is that if you're willing to make those real investments in relationships at all levels in school, then we're going to have places where children and adults can do more than just survive school. And I think there's a lot at the moment of just surviving and getting through it. And what we want to see is, as David said, is people flourishing and thriving. And that's what investing in relationships, that's what I've seen it can do.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's wonderful to hear, and I would echo that from my experience. I know that Anna Lebelska is with us today, and she's part of the Peaceful Schools movement. And when I visited one of her peaceful schools, a school I'd won an award, I was talking to the head teacher, and she actually said, "Oh, sorry, I think we're going to be kicked out of my office because some peer mediators need to use it to mediate a conflict." And you could hear the sort of pride in her voice that young people were taking that responsibility and developing those skills. And equally, when I've seen young people practice that sort of de-escalation and taking out blaming language, things that adults often find quite difficult, they can do an incredible job. But I do think it requires, like you say, the right context and support and culture. And I know that you do a lot to bring different schools together, as Crest does in Sheffield. And I think that's really important, so that schools can look at what other schools are doing and kind of celebrate the work together. So thank you, and we will hear more from you, Jackie, in the panel discussion. I know that your work and the work of Peacemakers, which has been going on for I think over 35 years in the West Midlands, is largely in primary settings, but building a culture of peace is obviously just as important for secondary schools. And now we're going to see a clip of a different school, Elizabeth Garret Anderson School, which is in Islington in London, where we've been lucky enough to do quite a bit of work in the past. We launched our Razor Wire and Olive Branches resource about Palestine and Israel there, which we've got very fond memories of. And when we recently visited, they were doing both work on their own identity and also global issues.
Today we want to be able to think about what things make us unique as people, which things we do as people that are kind of special to us, how things make us feel included, what things make us feel like we belong.
These workshops are absolutely important in helping young people shape and form who they are.
Okay, so first thing we are going to do is look at the words in which we are using across the school. So words like race, ethnicity, gender, sex, and class. What do you think these words mean?
Higher class. Yeah, higher class. Yeah. If you're in high class and you're really rich, you have a lot of money. Yeah.
Say me, compared to Janae. Yeah. That's because Janae's light skin, don't mean she's not black. Yeah.
If you don't feel like your race or gender have enough representation in the media, put your finger down. If someone has made an uncomfortable joke relating to your race, gender or class and you have stayed silent, put your finger down.
I speak English and Dari, which is my home language. This has made me really confident about myself, and there are many things I never thought that I could share with other people.
Culture is now established to such a degree that the young people would not allow us not to engage in this work, and I think that's really powerful in and of itself.
Today's topic is Muslim minority groups in Xinjiang, China. So instead of putting their images of them being persecuted, I thought let's humanize these people, that they do have a history, they do have a culture. Cultural genocide is the idea that you don't have the intention of killing off the entire group. What you want to do instead is wipe out their cultural or religious identity completely and make them adopt the whatever identity that you prefer them to have. Personally, what it was like when I was at school and the kind of issues that happened and affected students like myself who came from ethnic minority backgrounds but were generally ignored. You end up feeling quite invisible, and so I wanted, for me as a teacher, when I became a teacher, I wanted to do something where I don't just stick to the curriculum, but we talk about things that our students concerns our students, where they feel heard and where they feel seen.
I get immersed in the clips of the film, and I'd be happy to carry on watching, although I'm not sure you would, Hamidah. I thought that was so powerful, thank you. Hamidah, you're head of history at Elizabeth Garret Anderson School, and we've seen, even just from that clip, that you don't shy away from the difficult issues of peace and justice in the world, which is that outer layer in our model of peace outlined in the report and also used by other groups such as the Peaceful Schools movement. Something I've noticed is that you take care to make the global issues really relevant to your students. Could you tell us a bit more about your approach?
I look at it the way, as I'm head of history, as a history teacher, it's very easy to talk about any kind of difficult parts of history where you just talk about how a group of people were victims of something. So when it comes to the slave trade, for example, it's very easy to say this is what happened to the Africans, or when it comes to the Holocaust, it's very easy just to say, okay, this is what happened to the Jewish people in Europe. But then that kind of it kind of others them, and then it removes the fact that that there are other aspects of their identity. They weren't just victims of that particular thing that happened to them. So when it comes to teaching those bits of history, I always begin with talking about, okay, what was life for them like before this happened to them? So you humanize that story, and it means that our students can now relate to those people and understand that these things don't just happen to be like people who are just somehow inferior or just like easily made into victims. This can happen to anybody. And so when it came to when it came to discussing about the Uyghurs, I thought I think the first thing was, okay, what do our students not know about them? So one thing was to focus on, okay, what was their identity? How are they different to the Han Chinese majority in China, and understand how their culture was different, and therefore understand also that this is something that's happened recently to them. And it's not, they are people with a history and a culture. That's how we began with that conversation. And to make it something that our students can relate to so that our students can connect to these people, and not just look at these other people that stuff seem to have happened to them. And also the other way I look at it as well, trying to draw parallels with history. And unfortunately, much of the stuff that still happens today, in the situation in the Uyghurs, as a history teacher, I'm teaching about the Holocaust, and I can see the parallels there, and it allows our students to understand, see that these things have happened in the past, and to help to understand how these things happen as well. That's another focus I try to focus in why these things are happening and how it happens in the first place. So that's one example of the Uyghurs. But one of the things we did last year was when there was an outbreak of violence again in Israel and Palestine in the summer of 2021, sorry. This was on the news, but it was on social media a lot more. Now our young people in school were far more aware of what was going on, but there was lots of misunderstandings and misconceptions out there as well. And one of the things they asked is for the school to approach it. And I understood how challenging it was to approach that as a discussion base. But one of the when it comes to those difficult issues, I think
you can easily shy away from it and say it's too controversial or too political, and I'm not going to say anything. But the way I've come to approach this, I like the idea of principled impartiality, something I've taken on from the IAPI, who I'm sure Ellis will give a description of who they are. But it's basically the idea that as teachers, we are supposed to be politically neutral, but at the same time, when it comes to issues of human rights abuses, we can't be neutral on that. So when it came to the Uyghur situation, it's one of those things at the moment. It's quite highly politicized. We know that Western countries have spoken, governments have spoken out against it, and some other countries who have not, and they've got their own reason as to why that happens. But for me, we're not going to take it from a political perspective, but rather looking at, okay, what is the evidence that this is happening, and whether it's the Uyghur situation or whether it was about Israel Palestine. My starting point was looking at, okay, what are human rights organizations saying? And that's from that perspective, it's objective and we can speak it from that. The political side of things, we can leave that aside and therefore avoid any kind of accusations of you're taking a political side, things like that. But I really like the idea of principled impartiality. It allows us as teachers to explore those ideas, because at the end of the day, our students are listening to this and it's on the news. Actually, they're not actually watching the news. Most of them are on social media. So a lot of that, they end up with misconceptions and misunderstandings. And they even have told me that, it was really good that Miss, you actually discussed with us the Uyghur situation and about Israel Palestine, because there's lots of stuff out there where we don't know what is reliable and what isn't reliable. And the way that was delivered in school for both the Uyghur with the Uyghur workshop and about Israel Palestine last year. And one of the feedback was that it was really great that we did that, and we created an environment where our students did not feel that they were forced to form an opinion. They were given facts, and based on that, they got to form their own opinion about what was happening. And we also created a safe environment where we said it was not about saying us versus them and saying I'm for someone, I'm against someone, but it was looking at this was factually, this has happened, and we're going to look at where are we getting our information from. And that was the important thing, because I think it's really important, particularly in this day and age with all fake news, that we teach our young people how to source information. And it's very easy for them to be sucked into an echo chamber on social media or mainstream media and just take one sort of side or interpretation. But it's really important as educators, we equip our students with the ability to know how to actually source information that is unbiased and form their own opinions. That's really, really important. And also, therefore, we're making education relevant to them. Because one of the things that we had feedback from both of those workshops was that, thank you, Miss, for doing this, because this has made education relevant, because this is stuff that's happening on the news. And we're not just in history lessons talking about stuff that happened 1,000 years ago, but we're talking about stuff happening today. And we are given a safe space to have these conversations about quite sensitive issues as well. And I think a workshop like this and the one my colleague did about identity was quite important, because we have in our school in AGA, it's wonderful thing is that we've created an environment where it's okay. We've said it's okay to feel uncomfortable to have these discussions. Sometimes you don't have to say anything, but it's important that you listen to other people who are different from you, who have different experiences from you. It's really important that you understand that your experience in life will not be the same as someone else. And it's important that you listen to that, even if you find it uncomfortable to be part of that conversation, so long as you listen. That's really, really important. Because like I said, in social media, there's lots of, we live in I think, society right now where it's so easy to with cancel culture. As soon as someone says something that it doesn't agree with the majority, that person can feel like they're marginalized, they can't say anything, and then you create more animosity there, and then you create all these kind of extremist groups as well within the internet. And I think it's really important that we create a culture in school where young people learn the vocabulary and the sensitivity in approaching these conversations, and they know how to have that conversation, and so they become adults, who know how to, go in the real world and also take those skills. I think that's really important. And so, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say thank you. And I can see in the chat that people are so inspired by what you're saying. And having been in the school with you and in some of those sessions, I've seen how engrossed the students are in what they're doing with you. And I love the way that your colleague explored the personal identity and developed a kind of language. And I know that all your year sevens have those lessons, which I think then help.
The whole school, actually, at this point.
Fantastic. And I think you're then more able to have these other really difficult conversations, aren't you, about the more controversial issues. I also know that EGA is an explicitly anti-racist school, which is something that people could look up. The EGA's got a really good website, and we might even come back to that in the panel discussion. But if I can just say thank you so much for that rich contribution, Hamidah, and we'll come back to you in the panel. Because I really do think EGA brings together those different layers of peace, the kind of Venn diagram type model described in the report. We're now going to move to a different secondary school in different.
Izzy, I just wanted to mention before that we've had one good question come out in the chat, but I just want to remind everyone there's that opportunity to put any questions or reflections in the chat, and I will do my best to summarise them for the panel a bit later.
Thank you very much. And yes, we're gonna have a chance to hear more from everybody on lots of these topics in the panel discussion, which is brilliant. So yeah, we're moving to a different secondary school now, Carr Manor Community School in Leeds. The report shows the evidence that a restorative approach builds positive relationships and gives schools alternatives to punishments like exclusion. And Carr Manor Community School is an example of a school that's shown a sustained commitment to this ethos over many years. And so we're now going to see a clip from Carr Manor.
The intention is that we have every child in a position where they're listened to and they're able to speak on a regular basis, be it in their coaching program or be it in the way that we deliver our teaching and learning, or the way we deliver our flexible learning, which is extracurricular activities.
Boneless chicken.
To create the right conditions where children could, with adults and adults with adults, build positive relationships. And that's where we started all those years ago, and that's where we started to develop our circle work and our coaching programs, and our intention that we felt that if we built positive, strong relationships within the school community, that would spread into the local community, and that would give us social capital and give us some traction in terms of being able to challenge for improvement.
We would probably ask questions and try and make sure that we didn't force any views onto you. We just try and help you figure out yourself.
My experience was very good. You can really see how the person developed throughout the whole session and how their emotions changed from the beginning and when they left.
And the good thing about RP reps is that it's like what Amaya said, student to student, so they can empathise a bit more. But also, if you have an RP rep in the class, then they might be able to see what actually happened, because teachers don't always see.
It's also helpful because it means a teacher can keep on teaching the class while the student goes out and talks to them, and maybe it's better for them if the student's talking to them because they can sort of understand, but if a teacher's saying, oh, don't do this, they might not listen as much.
A restorative coach is a trained peacemaker who will talk to younger years to help them resolve their conflicts.
And I think the wider impact of the school is less violence and less conflict, because people get to reflect on themselves and how to repair the situation in a sense.
I think something that is very unique to Carr Manor is the confidence that the children have. Normally that's a skill that you sort of acquire later in life, but I think because they're empowered and they know that the adults around them really care about not only their academics but how they develop as a person, you can see that in how confident they are to answer. When they meet others who are new to Carr Manor, they're very welcoming and very honest and open. So I think that's definitely something that is unique about working here.
That's lovely to hear the young people talking about being restorative practice reps, RP reps, and kind of what it means to them. Tom Shaw, you're Director of Research Development at Carr Manor, and can you tell us a bit more about the everyday practices that go along with this approach?
Yeah, absolutely. Carr Manor, we're a through school in Leeds, so we go from 4 to 19, mainly through to 16. We've got just shy of 1,500 children. Many of those coming from really diverse backgrounds. We've got 67 different first languages and just under half on pupil premium. So it's a really diverse community, genuinely comprehensive. everyday practices where we try and make sure that we're consistent with a set of principles, some key processes, and then some skills that we're always trying to develop. So some of the key principles would be we're values driven. So we spend a lot of time looking at inclusive values and making sure that they're worked out every day. If I give you a couple of examples, one of our core values, which has been in place going right back to when Simon, who you saw in the video, started in the school in 2005, was know our children well. And so it's what does that look like to say that we need to know the children well? Well, it looks like Simon mentioned we have what's called coaching circles. So these circles meet 3 times a week, a Monday morning for check-in, Wednesday afternoon check-up, and then Friday afternoon check-out. And that coach, we call them, is responsible for 8 to 12 adults. And what we find is to get down to that ratio in a through school environment, we have to use every adult in the school. And so that means that teaching staff, support staff, whether you're on reception at the front of school or whether you're part of senior management, wherever you are in the school community, you are responsible for engaging with that small group of children. And we find that has a significant impact on creating a secure base, so there's a trusted adult that the children are connected with, but also that it develops a real social emotional capital within the community. So that means that relationships are right at the heart of what we do. But you asked about kind of everyday practices. Well, that's not quite every day. That's just Monday, Wednesdays and Fridays. Everyday practices. Also, we take that approach to relationships into the classroom as well. So when we want to have a discussion as a class around what our expectations will be of each other, we sit in a circle and we'll establish what we call a learning relationship agreement. And this is where we establish what the expectations are together. And then we work together to make sure that those expectations are consistently met. Again, that's putting the relationships right at the heart. Does that mean that everything works perfectly all of the time? I was delighted when you said earlier that schools committed to pursuing peace don't have to be perfect schools. That's a real relief, because there's lots of ways that we're continuing to try and improve and improvise in the model that we're doing. But it is about those everyday practices. If I perhaps give you another quick example, we talk a lot about how we communicate with each other and how communication needs to engage, explain and expect, so that we're not just coming in with expectations all the time, which can be a high level of demand and can, depending on how that's presented, can cause difficulty, particularly for children that might have social, emotional, mental health issues. So we're really attentive to how we communicate, what we say and the way that we say it. And that's an expectation we'd have of all the adults and indeed children across the school every day in all of our interactions, right down from simple things like sending an email to talking to a class or speaking to somebody in a corridor. So it's very much an approach which is about key principles, but it's about what that looks like in our everyday interactions.
I think that's so important, that care you take in kind of building your community in that way. I'd just like to ask as well, there are a lot of people who, there's huge amount of support for restorative practice. It's very strong in our report, but there are equally a lot of teachers who say, we tried that, it didn't work. It's, things are too difficult here, and are quite skeptical about it. I know we haven't got very long, but have you got a kind of answer or response to that?
Yeah, I think my observation would be that over the last 20 years, I think restorative practices have been introduced in a range of ways across the education system. And I think we have to be honest about the fact that sometimes that model of implementation has been a real train and hope model, where somebody comes in and downloads some information or a manual, and then schools are left to try and put that into practice. And I think that's led us to a situation where we have got schools that have tried to do it, and actually and it's not worked well. And I've encountered schools like that. We're now increasingly working with schools that want to explore this. And one of the things we find is when people come and see what we do, we run immersion days where people can visit. When people come and see what that we do and they get a feel for it, often some of those principles, which can seem quite abstract, actually take on a concrete expression. And it's not that people need to do what we do, but once people have seen what it can look like, that can be a real encouragement. I think one of the key things that often comes up in our conversations can be about how it's not a discrete intervention. Often when people talk about restorative practices, they talk about what happens when we need to repair a relationship. But as previous speakers have already mentioned, that's not how we understand it. In fact, when people come on immersion days, we have to make sure we remember to mention that. Because in actual fact, for us, thinking in a relational restorative way, in a way that means that we can genuinely pursue positive peace, is about how leaders act and talk and speak, how we organise the staffing resource and how staff are deployed. It's around how we organise the environment in which the school exists. It's about what happens in unstructured time, at break time, at 10:15, where people are and what people are doing. It's about the whole range of activity within the school. And so working in a relational restorative way for us is about making sure that everything we do is filtered through those core values, which means we can then have more confidence that we are genuinely building peace and not just trying to keep the peace. Although there are times when we have to do that too.
Of course, and for me, it's just amazing to hear you talking in that kind of peace language, and I can see there that you're using that idea or that model, which is discussed again in the report, of schools will need to do some peace keeping, which might even involve, well, there's all sorts of things that might involve, but people being apart from each other. There might be some peacemaking, which is where people will need to come together when there's been a problem, but there also needs to be this huge investment in peace building, which I think is what you're doing so strongly at Carr Manor. So thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be questions that will come back to you in the panel, and I'm sure people will be keen to come on your already very popular immersion days. So I don't know how you're going to cope with that, but it's a good challenge to have. So thank you very much, Tom.
Pleasure.
We're now going to move to a school which has actually taken on the mantle of Peace School, along with many other schools which are part of a growing network in Wales of peace schools supported by the Welsh Centre for International Affairs. And when I visited Cyfarthfa High School in Merthyr, they were exploring conscientious objection in a time of war. So we're going to have a quick look at that now.
On what grounds have you come here today?
Many millions are dying, fighting in this war. And why do you think you individually are better than those poor people?
My name is Mr. Alfred Evan-Jones, and I'm here today for my tribunal on the cause of not wanting to go to war. I'd like to stress that I'm doing this as my duty to these young people, to these children, not to people of war, not to violence.
In World War I, British conscientious objectors were forced to defend their beliefs at tribunals. Students reenact the tribunals to explore the choices and dilemmas they faced.
When we first started the Peace Project, the pupils of Cyfarthfa High School came up with a peace pledge. Cyfarthfa High School's pledge is, we are actively working to ensure that pupils develop rights respecting active citizens of our local community, Wales and the world.
And it was just a blank wall, and we thought maybe something more personal should be on there, so inspirational quotes and a reminder that we as Cyfarthfa are a family. Taking everything you have said into consideration, we as a tribunal have decided that we are going to deny your right to conscience objection. Thank you.
83 years ago yesterday, Minnie James opened this Temple of Peace in hopes to create a peace for our future and for the younger generation. And we, as the younger generation, are standing here hoping to do the same for our school.
I wanted to hear more of that singing, which was actually one of the students who impromptu gave us that fantastic rendition of Canon Lan in the Temple of Peace. We've got Jane Harries, who works in that building for the Welsh Centre for International Affairs and runs the Peace Schools network. Jane, people's response to war is personal, a matter of conscience, but it's also political. What's your perspective on how we as educators explore these bigger peace questions?
I think I'm going to reflect a little bit of what Hamidah said earlier. I think people worry about talking about big topics like peace and war that can be distressing for children and young people apart from anything else. And also they're worried about political bias, I think. But as we've seen with the current war in Ukraine, I mean, it's out there. Young people are imbibing the news. They might be, they might pick up partial messages. So I think it's really important that as educators, we are openly discussing with them about those topics in a balanced and sensitive manner. But I also think that it's about supporting them in looking at those conflicts from different perspectives, so that they can actually weigh up what the moral issues are. And it's also exploring peace and war in terms of moral dilemmas and what the human consequences of war are. And I think what would be essential for me would be that considering war in terms of human values and human rights, as Hamidah mentioned when she was talking about that. But also it's about critical thinking, and it's about thinking as well. In the Wales curriculum, we talk about ethical informed citizens of Wales and the world, and it's encouraging those kind of values. So I think it is really important that we do that.
Yes, and I think there's a real opportunity in Wales, isn't there? Because the curriculum is really a peace curriculum, given that it's asking for that.
Yeah, we've got a bit of a gift.
Yeah, brilliant.
Shall I give you just a quick example of what a peace school did? This was a year 8 school over in West Wales, and it was the time of the Syrian war, and they did a whole peace project. But one of the things that they did is they considered a continuum of statements about whether the UK should or should not be involved in bombing Syria if Assad used chemical weapons. And that obviously, there was a whole range of opinions about that. And they looked at them in terms of, well, was that green or red in terms of, was that pro or against bombing Syria? And then they had to decide as an advisor to Theresa May, what advice would they give her? So they had to critically look at those and weigh up all the moral dilemmas. But that was just one example of what a school did.
Thank you. And I can see a lot of overlaps with your perspective and Hamidah's, so maybe you could share an exchange between your approaches.
Definitely.
and Peacemakers and Carr Manor and the others. And can you just tell us a little bit more about the Peace Schools network?
Yeah, well, the Peace Schools scheme is really a framework. So what we've got in the scheme is schools can put in whatever the aspects they want to do under certain headings. So we've got ethos, developing a peaceful ethos. We've got learning in the curriculum, leadership and management, because it's got to be part of your behaviour policies and how people relate to one another in the school. And then really critically, it's about learners as young peacemakers. So from the start of the Peace School scheme, we've always emphasised that the young people should be consulted at the beginning. Well, what is a peace school? What would that look like for you? What would the playground look like? What would lessons look like? How would people relate to one another? So they've got to be really involved in forming that scheme themselves. And they're then part of forming an action plan with the senior management team, and they can become a peace school on 3 levels. The first level is very much about embedding that into their school ethos, and then increasingly teaching and learning, and also young people as active peacemakers taking on projects. So that's the kind of thing that the scheme does.
That's fantastic. And I know that's why the students were standing outside that very colourful wall. That was the wall alongside some toilets, wasn't it? And it was very inspiring. And
everyone had to go there.
And they decided to make it a wall about what peace meant to them, really, and it was asking questions, wasn't it? And again, yes. I think that school was looking at peace at those many different levels, from kind of mental health through to how do they handle conflict, through to looking at the big questions like war, and our relationship with the earth, with the planet. And I know that you use the term peace heritage quite a lot. You help children and young people explore their peace heritage, and I love that idea, discovering these hidden stories of peace and peacemakers. And I know you've done a lot of that in Wales, and that's really inspiring. And I'd just like to say all the best. I know that tomorrow at the Senedd, there's a new cross-party group being launched on peace and reconciliation, and you're launching your paper pushing for kind of peace education policy in Wales. So all the best with that. And we might get some questions that come back to you.
Have I got a time for another example or not?
You can squeeze in
I've run
one.
out of time.
You squeeze in one, Jane, go on.
But just to mention that obviously it's, and I know as Paul said at the beginning, you know, we've got these huge challenges, haven't we, as humanity, and it's very difficult to divide out peace and from sustainability. And I think it's really important that the young people are seeing peace as part of the sustainable development goals. And just an example, little primary school in Wrexham, they looked at sustainable development goal 16, which is about peace, justice and strong institutions. And it was quite inspiring what they did, because they were looking at World War I. A lot of children study World War I. What was it like living on rations? So then they asked themselves, well, hang on a minute, who's living like that now? Oh, children in Yemen. Let's find out about children in Yemen. So they researched children in Yemen. And then they thought, well, what's happening in our own local community? So they went back to the food bank in Wrexham, and they visited the food bank, and they learned about issues like that. So they've done a real toing and froing, and then they learned about making do and mend, and that people had to, you know, darn things in World War I. So what does fast fashion do? And they looked at fast fashion and did a project around that. But that was all led by the young people, because they wanted to look at Sustainable Development Goal 16, but they wanted to explore it in a local and global level. And they did a lot of toing and froing between history and what's happening now.
Fantastic. I can see why your scheme is growing. And I love the fact that, again, it builds on the different levels of peace. So thank you so much. Again, we're hopefully going to come back to you, because we're now going to bring the panel together. Ellis has joined us to share with us some of the threads or themes that have been coming out of the chat.
Hi, everyone. This is just going to be a quick bit from me. So lots of positivity in the chat about all the speakers. A theme that came out a little while ago was human rights and democracy. People mentioned the Human Rights Act and the government saying that that's now on the way out as far as they're concerned. And Paul and lots of other people working for the Quakers have already been looking a lot at other threats to democracy and civil society in Britain as well. So that's an interesting context. I know we've got some friends from Protection Approaches here, and they've got an event tomorrow afternoon on democratic education, which overlaps very much with peace education, I think. So I'd encourage them to post something in the chat now about that, but perhaps a theme people can pick up. Another question was about non-violent communication, that practice that Marshall Rosenberg spoke about in the 1970s and wrote about, and is probably connected to the peer mediation and the restorative approaches that Jackie and Tom have been talking about. There was sort of lots of agreement with that idea of being uncomfortable sometimes. And perhaps when we're talking about issues like racial equality, that would be interesting to hear more about. So that's just a little bit of me reflecting the chat. Sorry if I haven't captured everything, but something perhaps for the panel to be food for thought.
Thank you so much. And it's very helpful that people in the chat are responding to each other, because it's too much for one or two people to deal with. I know that another question that's come through in the chat is whether schools outside Wales can become peace schools. And Jane's particular scheme is for schools in Wales, isn't it, Jane? And it links very much with the Welsh curriculum. But there's the Peaceful Schools movement, and Anna Lewelska is in one of our participants. She, I'm sure, could put a link to that in the chat now, which also follows a kind of level system. And then there's organisations like Peacemakers. There's immersion days that you can go to at Carr Manor. There's examples to mediate. So I think schools can actually use peace education organisations in their local area. Check out the resources. Following this meeting, we're going to send a follow-up email, which will have more opportunities to gather together. So yes, I think schools can become peace schools, though maybe not in exactly the same way that Jane is presenting. Okay, so the themes from Ellis. The first one was around the Human Rights Act, how that might affect peace education, threats to civil society. I wonder if we could ask David, because we haven't heard from you partly for a while, David, and the report's main author, if you'd like to share something on that, but if not, feel free to pass the baton to anyone else that wants to.
I'll have a go. It's very difficult because there's so many ramifications of that. I mean, one of the human rights that children have is to a good education. So if you start to erode those kinds of rights, at the moment they're fundamental principles which are which schools and young people themselves can use to mobilize certain kinds of action and activity. If that's taken away, then it's no longer clear that children have these clear rights to health and education and so on. Some of those are in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, some of those are in the Human Rights Act, and other legal instruments as well. I think it really underlines the importance of bringing these issues before young people, and also from an early age, not only secondary school students, but primary school students too, in an age-appropriate way, so that they can bring their own perspectives to bear. They can learn what the questions are, what the generative queries are, and bring their own perspectives to bear on the issue itself. Exchange, listen to one another, be supported to speak up for their own view and be heard, so that when young people leave school, and indeed before they leave school, they have stronger critical thinking skills in order to be politically and socially conscious and responsible in their own interests in the long run. There was one study that found that only 2% of students leaving secondary school had the critical thinking skills that were necessary to navigate the news, for example, 2%. So it's really hard for schools because, as Richard said in the clip, the curriculum is so busy. So it's important, I think, to bring the critical thinking skills into the curricular areas, into geography, history, English, maths as well, and personal and social health education, and so on. So that the very way in which the subjects are explored by young people engage critical thinking and empathy as part of the critical thinking as well. And in that way, how is it that our society is allowing this to happen? This is the adult generation allowing this to happen. So hopefully, allowing it to happen uncritically is what I mean. So I think there's so much that schools can do, which actually enhances the quality of the teaching and the learning, which would support young people in the long run when they take over from us, as it were, to engage with these issues in a more politically responsible way than we seem to be doing.
Thank you, David. Well, you had a good go at that answer, although definitely throwing out some challenges for all of us. Did anyone else want to come in on anything David raised there? You're mentioning a lot about critical thinking, which is something that Hamidah mentioned, and navigating the news and helping young people navigate social media. Did anyone want to add anything?
I'd just say that what a lot of schools do, of course, and from a very early age, is look at the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. I mean, that is in a way into human rights, isn't it? So, I mean, I think children's understanding develops from quite an early age in that respect. And if they're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, well, that's all about the things that everybody should have in order to lead a fulfilled life. That's what we're aiming to. That's what the UK is supposed to be aiming towards by 2030.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. The Rights Respecting Schools scheme is really, really popular, isn't it, as well? So a lot of this is quite deeply embedded in schools. Thank you. Hamidah, did you want to add anything then? I wasn't sure.
I think, yes, in terms of what was said before about curriculum, that yes, there's a lot. The curriculum is sometimes quite fixed, and finding the time to do this can feel like there isn't time, and then you don't have the time, not only time to fit into the curriculum, but finding the time to then plan something that's happening, that is ongoing. But for me, I think one of the reasons I do it is because you can get as a teacher, you can get quite bored of just sticking to the curriculum. It can get quite boring as education, and you want to make education relevant. Because these conversations pop up in your classes anyway during tutor time, and you know that's happening. And then you have some teachers who are saying, oh, I don't feel comfortable to have this conversation because I don't know enough. And fair enough, that's absolutely fine. But with those teachers who do, who are quite informed of what's going on and understand how to navigate this conversation, I think it's, especially humanities teachers, I think it's really important that we make education relevant and we create an environment where our students actually know how to navigate this conversation, because they will always come up and say, why aren't we talking about this? And because they're interested in having this conversation. And then I sometimes hear like, clearly there's some sort of misunderstanding, misconception they're already getting. And it's really important that we address that, because like I said, I think we live in an age where information just gets spread so quickly, and our young people don't know sometimes. Many of them do know, can identify when something is fake news, but sometimes it's not as obvious as it's not that obvious. And it's really important that we show them how to navigate that world, and in an increasing world where things get very polarized. And even with the situation with Ukraine, I recognize that, okay, this is on the news. Our students clearly will be talking about it. They know what's happening, but they don't know the why. And it was important that we look at it from a historical perspective about why it was happening, and put everyone sort of on the same page for our students, because there was also lots of students saying things like, oh, miss, you know, is there going to be a world war? You know, what's going to happen? Are we going to get, you know, is there going to be a nuclear warfare? And I think it was important that, okay, yes, unfortunately, the media's at the moment sort of pumping out a message which is unhealthy, and it was important for us to take a step back and say, actually, this is what the media is saying, but what is actually going on? Is there a likelihood of this actually happening? Realistically, no. And let's talk about the why that is the case. And again, it wasn't about our opinion, it was about finding resource where what's already out there, and reliable resources out there, reliable news organizations that have spoken about in a balanced way, and finding that and then discussing that. And we've had lots of positive also feedback from staff as well, saying thank you for actually addressing this, because we have staff who do want to do that. Not everybody has the time to do that, and I'm someone who is happy to address it, but sometimes it's like I want to do it, but then it's like I don't have the time. I've got so many other things to do. I know my GCSEs to mark and this, that, and the other, but then there's also self, you know, I feel fulfilled that I actually did something that is actually relevant. And often young people will say education doesn't feel relevant, and this is when you do make it relevant. So that's quite important.
Thank you, Hamidah. And I know that one thing you also do at EGA is where you can, you inviting people to share their stories, yes, don't you? Yeah. So when Afghanistan was in the news a lot, I remember you brought in a local Afghan head teacher. Yeah.
Our head teacher has a connection with an Afghan woman who used to be a head teacher in Afghanistan. She lives here with her children now. They came here as refugees. And so when everything in Afghanistan happened after the summer, they were invited in. It was quite a moving thing, actually, just hearing from their perspective what their experience was like and life under the Taliban. So that was quite moving, and a lot of our students were really engaged in that.
Thank you. And perhaps we move to the second sort of theme, which was around sort of non-violent communication and restorative practice. I know that in the chat, RJ Working have kindly mentioned that schools can be recognised by the Restorative Justice Council. And of course, there's huge overlaps. The report looks a lot at restorative approaches and sees that as kind of part of peace education, whereas perhaps there was some gaps or differences between us before, but actually if we have this model of the sort of layers of peace, I think it's very complementary. So if anybody wanted to comment on the journey a school has taken, a restorative journey, or anything about the use of non-violent communication within that, then would anyone like to comment?
I can start on the non-violent communication if you like. Is my internet okay? Okay. So yeah, I think there is a place for NVC in peace education, and I do most of my work in primary schools, but we teach children how to use I statements, and I would say the way that we prefer to teach it is to model it. So I often model I statements before I teach them, so that then children, I can then ask them, have you ever heard that kind of statement before? And they can recognise it first, because it's quite a hard thing to do for young children to do. So modelling, I think, is key. Being able to model the kind of communication that that will be respectful and will help to de-escalate things, because children will pick up what they hear around them.
Yeah, Jackie, when I've been in schools that you've worked with, they've talked a lot about you being on the journey with them, modeling circles, because I think there's a lot of talk about things like circle time, and people think they know it and they think it's straightforward, but actually what often happens is they're used occasionally in an ad hoc way, often where there's a problem, rather than being used regularly in ways that actually help people. I know Tom mentioned knowing the students and students being able to talk about their feelings regularly, and I think modeling that and helping teachers on that journey to do things differently is really important.
Yeah, and I think we model circles with staff as well, so they can see us when it doesn't go well as when it goes really well. You know, as we've already said, sometimes things aren't perfect, and I think it's great when a teacher can see us having to deal with things in the moment as well, and we can model some approaches for dealing with that and discuss it afterwards. And that's where that dealing with the discomfort comes from. And when we can say that was a really tricky moment, or that was a moment where I really didn't know what to do, and to stay with it and not just gloss over it, but to explore it and to understand what was happening. You know, was it a values clash, or was it I don't know, just I've never dealt with it before and I didn't know what to do. So yeah, that modeling, that practice, that not being afraid to go back and try again, I think that's really, really critical in terms of that journey. So many of our schools might start with peer mediation, they might do a bit of curriculum work around PSHE, then they go, staff need a bit more training, what can you do about restorative practice? So there can be different ways that people approach it. They might start with restorative, go to circles, they might start with circles. There's a myriad of ways that people can start. Just start.
Thank you, Becky. Just start. And I'm interested in that idea of the moral ambiguity or staying with uncomfortability, and someone quoted in the report several times, Don Rowe, who was one of the founders of the Citizenship Foundation. He wrote some resources a long time ago to help early years teachers leave moral dilemmas with their classes, and what he found was that quite often teachers would jump to pointing out the right thing to do in the situation because of a feeling of a moral responsibility to teach the right thing, which I think we can all relate to. But actually his point was often you just need to give the space and time for the children to explore it and kind of feel it and try out different perspectives, and that's actually where you get change and growth. But that idea of having some uncomfortability and sort of sitting with that, has anyone else got anything they'd like to share on that? The role of that in peace education, being uncomfortable.
I'll be happy to speak. I think, so we've done quite a few things, as you would have saw from the video as well. So what my colleague did with the identity workshop, exploring different things like about gender, social class, disabilities, race, all of those things. And I think the idea is that some people find talking about certain aspects more uncomfortable than others, and other people would be more willing to talk about it. So say, for example, race, some people will find it more comfortable to talk about that than others. Same thing you could take for social class, for example. But I think it's really important that at the school, what we've done is created an environment where we said it's okay to be uncomfortable. And I think it's really important that as teachers, you say also, often do this when it comes to talking about stuff like this, is say, there are some things I don't know everything about, and I'm ignorant about certain things, and I'm here to listen. And sometimes, we can make mistakes in what we say. We may not know the language and how to maybe ask a question, but that's okay. It's okay to make those mistakes, but it's about learning from those mistakes. And it's also creating environments telling our students that if you identify, if you think, oh, that person maybe asked something that you didn't really like, maybe it sounded slightly offensive to you, it's okay. You don't just start badgering them, say, how dare you say that? But it's about teaching people and teaching our young people, okay, this is the kind of vocabulary, this is the way, sensitivity in which you can approach this discussion. But it's very important that they don't feel like, okay, I can't have this conversation, I can't be part of it. Only some people can be part of it. And it doesn't happen overnight. It does take some time, and it's an ongoing approach as well. But it's about creating that culture where you say, this is part of school life. These are things we talk about, and it's not just in some workshop we talk about it, but it will be part of other aspects of your lesson, your English lesson, when you're talking about some poem to do with whatever it is to do with that. So that's that environment, and that's what we've done as a school when it came to we created an anti-racist school it doesn't mean that you only talk about it in history lessons and RE lessons, but it's about whole school approach to that as well. So yes, I think it's okay. It's as teachers, I think you need to also show that as well. I might find some things uncomfortable and I don't know everything, and that's okay. I'm here to learn as well. That's the important thing.
Thank you, Hamidah. Did anyone want to add to that?
I've popped up again. Oh, I'll let Tom go first, but then I'll bring something from the chat as well.
No, Ellis, do. I was going to pick up on the chat, so you highlight the bit that you were wanting to focus on.
Right. Well, we might be on the same page. So there's been a few questions about trauma-informed approaches. Obviously, there's a lot of work happening at the moment on adverse childhood experiences. So there's both trauma when we think about young people coming from conflict internationally, but also there'll be a lot of trauma just in everyday life in Britain, unfortunately. So how we sort of synthesize peace education with those approaches and do so safely. And are there examples of that in practice? And there was also a question about the kind of commitments that a school actually makes, or peace educator makes. But over to you then.
That's just what I was going to pick up on. A couple of things that Jackie, you mentioned around working with staff, and another thing mentioned in the chat box was around staff being uncomfortable with these approaches. And I think we've got to recognise that we live in an environment where for some adults in schools, both their experience and their pattern through their profession has been one where their role has been dependent on a hierarchical, unequal distribution of power and having systems which can sustain and perpetuate that. And so I think it is a journey for people to begin to open to the possibility of, yes, recognising the need for peacekeeping, but also bringing something more of themselves into the relationships with the children and indeed with other staff. So one of the things we do is we also have staff circles, and not just circles with the children, and the staff circles meet every week. They happen just before the children's circles. And so when we talk about role modelling and dialogue with children, actually we're wanting to do the same with staff, because in the end it's around what we do with the human beings in the environment, which can help us to move towards a positive peace. So beginning to break down some of those barriers. And I think that also connects to where I think we need to draw together as many threads as possible into what can help us move towards positive peace. So if that's trauma-informed practice, for me, my experience of doing that has been able to recognise some of the neuroscience that helps us understand more effectively what's going on and the impact of previous experiences. And therefore, for some teachers in schools, that's been the turning point that's helped them to be able to see how important that building, maintaining, repairing relationships is, as they've got to really understand and know the children through the lens of trauma-informed practice. A really quick example of what that looks like is, I mentioned earlier, we talk about engage, explain, expect. That can work for repairing a relationship because you engage with what's happened, you look to get explanation for both perspectives, then move on to expect. But it also works for emotion coaching. So emotion coaching is something that's come out of trauma-informed practice, and that starts with empathy and validating and labeling, and then moves on to setting limits if necessary, and then problem solving. But actually it follows the same pattern. So what we find is we can stick to the same process, engage, explain, expect, but then we can overlay into that different understandings of the way staff can interact. One of the things I find most moving when we engage in this area is the impact it has on staff. I've nearly every time I've ever done any training, it's the moment at which staff catch me and say, oh, that's going to be really helpful in school, but actually that's going to make a massive difference at home as well. Often on their parenting. Certainly that's been my experience. And once again, we begin to see the impact of taking the human development seriously within school communities, because it's not just about what happens in school, it's also what happens in our homes and in the homes of all those connected to the community.
Thank you, Tom. It's lovely to see in the chat people saying maximum respect to all presenters. It's so heartening to be part of this community. And I absolutely feel the same. I feel there's huge elements of the report that we haven't had time to touch on. I was very moved by a lot of the discussion in the report around the need to reduce or even completely stop exclusions, permanent exclusions, because of the damage they do, particularly to certain parts of the school population. And I know, Tom, your school's been on quite a journey around that. I wondered if you might have 30 seconds to say something on the exclusion journey before we draw things to a close.
Yeah, I mean, exclusions is a complex area, but back in 2005, Simon, who you saw on the video, he made a decision that the school was not going to permanently exclude. So we've not had permanent exclusions for 17 years. We're not alone in the city with that, because in order to make that possible, we've got really close partnership working with other local schools in what's called an area inclusion partnership. But also we have the lowest fixed term exclusions in the city, and have consistently had that. Not least because we don't think exclusion is the best way of moving forward. One of our key principles is we have no selection on entry or exit. That once children are with us, we want to work with them, and that's part of what it means to make a real commitment to working inclusively. That means you have to be really creative, and it puts pressure on the organisation, because you've got to think about how are we going to work in ways that means that we can continue to create space, even in situations where things do get complicated and you've got children that are struggling to meet those expectations. But we find that by making the principled decision, that then pushes us to work creatively and do a lot of the preventative upstream work that that I've mentioned earlier.
That's massively inspiring. Thank you so much to all the panelists and to everyone that's participated and been here and put so much into the chat. These are obviously ongoing conversations. I'm sorry our time is coming to an end together. I do want to thank everyone that's been here, the panelists, all the children's staff who made the films and the report possible. A huge thank you to David for an enormous amount of work and careful research that's gone into it, and all the pioneering peace educators who've gone before us, who this draws upon, their work, your work, you know who you are. And please look out for a follow-up email containing the recording of this, a chance to sign up for more support and opportunities for us to be together again and to share practice. More events are going to be posted in the chat as well. I started by quoting Bell Hooks, who's quoted in the report, because I love that phrase, the classroom being a location of possibility. And I'd like to end on a quote from Quaker Faith and Practice, which is from 1986, because peace education has been going for some time. You could say all time, couldn't you? And it's 2385. From someone called Janet Gilbraith. And she said, I feel peace education is about teaching children to discover that they have the power to change things that they see are wrong and developing the imagination to find alternative responses to conflict. The two qualities which are most important to children of today are hope and imagination. Hope to believe they can change the world they live in, and imagination to find ways to do so. If you feel excited about the possibilities of peace education, please do download the report, share it with people, talk about it, and let's all together continue to build peace in our schools. Thank you so much, everyone.